Hello, good evening, welcome to the seminar at Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule in Berlin. I am KIRILL GERSTEIN, and I am thrilled that for this final session this semester, Iván Fischer, the great visionary conductor and musician, has agreed to join us, and Iván will talk about the future, and I'm sure that involves also talking about the past and the future of music making, the past and the future of that amazing instrument, the Symphony Orchestra, and I'm very curious myself where our discussion will take us with a mind such as Iván's to guide us. Welcome and thank you, Iván.
Thank you. It's an honor to be asked to speak about this. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great to have you. So you wrote, and this was shared with our participants, the sort of tantalizing lines. Will there be a symphony orchestra in the future, in some years or in 100 years? And will it be similar to what we have today? And that already has many differences. And also, or if it will need to reform. So what are your thoughts on it today, and have been, I think, for the past decades, that you are making Budapest Festival Orchestra into something very unique in this world?
Well, I have to start with saying that emotionally, this is not an easy subject to talk about for me, because whenever I speak about the symphony orchestra as an endangered species, which I think might even die out in a few decades or centuries, then people think that I don't care about it. And I feel much more like there would be a lover of elephants who talks about that maybe there will be no more elephants in 100 years. And we love elephants, so we should make sure that they do exist. So I feel similarly that I think the symphony orchestra is a wonderful, great group. It's a phenomenon which is one of the most beautiful things I know, and I see that it's an endangered art form. And I think it must reform itself if it doesn't want to be simply wiped out by history. Now, I suggest, but please let me know if it's a good idea, that first I would say a few thoughts about what are the dangers I see which the present form of symphony orchestra has today. And then we will turn about how it can reform itself and what can be done. Is that all right for you, Kirill?
That's a wonderful plan, absolutely.
Okay, then let me say a few things without a kind of an order of importance. There will be more important and less important dangers, but each of them are well-known facts. I start with one which doesn't seem to be a huge danger, but it is, and that is the volume. The volume issue is getting worse and worse, and at a certain point it will not be a stoppable development. What is happening with the volume? It increases all the time. Why? Because instrumentalists naturally want to play louder. It's a human thing. You want to express yourself with bigger and bigger sound. So, for example, a brass player says, look at this wonderful mouthpiece. It gives a round, beautiful, bigger sound. Or a string player says, somebody invented this new E string on the violin and it shines so wonderful. It's a little bigger than the other one was. People are always looking intuitively for bigger and bigger sound. And I don't blame them, it's natural. The singer also wants to increase the volume as much as possible. Now, this leads to a few dangerous developments. One is, for example, the relationship between voice and instrument. In today's opera environment, if somebody sings a Wagner role, a big one, that singer needs a rest of maybe 2 days between performances. If you look up the biographies of singers early 20th century, like the generation of Leus Lesac, tenor, it's amazing to read that somebody sang Belmonte on Monday and Tristan on Tuesday. So it seems that the voice were less trained. They didn't have to make themselves heard over this huge volume of an orchestra. My guess is that an orchestra sounds twice as loud as around the time of Gustav Mahler or Strauss, simply because of the slow, gradual development of instruments. And now, why is it a threat? Because many musicians have difficulties with hearing if the trumpet is behind you, if you know it's too loud. And now musicians go to court, lawyers come into the picture. This is a slow phenomenon, a problem, which can actually kill the symphony orchestra. But this is just one. I mean, if you have any questions about it, I'm happy to elaborate, but let's go to other.
But I think we'll come back to the individual points, of course.
Okay. Another danger which I see is the repertoire. This is an even bigger danger, that the symphony orchestra is a combination of musicians, which you can actually see in a score of what the generation we just talked about, like Richard Strauss, Mahler, and contemporaries. This is more or less the symphony orchestra with 16 first violins, maybe 8 double basses, 4 to 5 woodwinds, number of horns, trumpets, and so on. And the orchestra became a rigid institution employing the score of Gustav Mahler or the score of Richard Strauss. And these are the combination of musicians. And each orchestra thinks that they have to do this because this is the norm. So we have this fixed composure of instrumentalists in a symphony orchestra. What do these people play? They don't really go back too much nowadays before the music of, let's say, Haydn, because that is left to Baroque specialists. They don't really go often into contemporary music, now and then, yes, but it's not the core repertoire. The core repertoire of an orchestra is Haydn to, let's say, Messiaen. And this is a slice of the music history of, I would say, 200 years. Now, do we really seriously believe that in 100 years or 150 years, people will want to listen to this 200-year history in music all the time? Because this is what an orchestra has to concentrate on, because this is the composure. This is how the orchestra is formed, with the number of musicians. This is what they can play well. I don't think they can play well music by Machaut or Monteverdi or ensemble music or Indian folk music. This is not their character. And now the repertoire is actually relatively small, but we live in a generation which already speaks another language. The language of today is the best illustration I can say is that if you sit in a car and you open your radio and you keep turning the stations, then you will hear a fantastic mix. You may hear a bit of a Bruckner symphony, you may hear something, I don't know, early music and heavy metal and Indonesian gamelans. You hear all kinds of things, and this is what our generation hears everywhere, from elevators, from phone automatic voicemail messages. It's pouring towards us, the mix, this eclectic mix, which I would say is our musical language. Now, within this mix, the orchestra can only play one specialized area, the classical orchestral music between Haydn and Messiaen, with a little earlier and a little later, I understand, but most of the time, this is what we orchestras perform. And it's a narrow segment, and it doesn't mirror the musical language of our generation. And this will get worse and worse and worse. Our children, grandchildren will feel further and further remote from the generations for which the repertoire of a symphony orchestra was the norm. It will not be the norm in a few generations. So I think concentrating on this narrow range of repertoire is a second danger. I hope, Kirill, you're still hearing me.
Very much. Engrossed in your discourse.
Now, this is like the second danger I wanted to mention. And the third one, I just touch on it because it's a more controversial topic. It's probably less facts and more subjective ideas, but still I want to mention it. And that is the lack of creativity in a symphony orchestra. Now, what do I mean with that? What I do mean is that musicians go to school. They go to teachers, they study, and then at a certain point, or before that point, before they graduate, their individuality is developed, encouraged. The teachers are interested in what is this child doing, what kind of person she or he is. And then this musician joins a symphony orchestra, and from that moment, this applies to the majority of the symphony orchestra, the tutti string players, that's the largest group. Never again is their creativity asked. All they have to do is to follow the instructions of the conductor, the concertmaster, the principal, follow the habits and the rules of the symphony orchestra to their best knowledge. People do it honestly and with a lot of love and care, and I have great admiration of orchestra musicians, but I think their creativity is not asked anymore. Nobody goes to them and says, what are you interested in? Do you have new ideas about music? How can you contribute to innovation in music? It's stopped and they fulfill a task. Why? Because the symphony orchestra has grown out of an era where generations before us were in a much more hierarchic society, and the norm was that there are leaders, even dictators, who tell you what is right and wrong and what to do, and there are people who follow the leadership. So there is a too rigid leadership and hierarchy system in an orchestra, and it cuts out the creativity of the individual musician. puts all the responsibility into the hands of a handful of people like the executive director, the board chairman, or the conductor. And the large majority of artists, the musicians in an orchestra, are not really demanded, not asked, not demanded, not encouraged. Now, I understand one can argue about it. There are certainly exceptions, I say, but what I do observe is that this lack of creativity or lack of demand for creativity causes a lot of frustration in musicians, which can easily lead to a jaded, switched off type of music making, where people detach themselves and actually do everything well, but without their own creative input. So I think this is a third danger, which endangers the symphony orchestra. And I see that these things need to be addressed, because if the dangers are not addressed, then it can simply disappear from the map. What we see, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, is that there are no orchestral concerts because too many musicians and too large concert halls. This whole ritual of 100 people on stage and 2,000 in the hall is at the moment not possible, and people easily live without it. Everybody, the whole society wants to save airlines and tourist industry, but there's a little less effort to save the symphony orchestra. There's a little effort, but not, I don't think, a major one. And if with the third or the fourth pandemic in the next few decades, there is certainly a danger. How long will politicians or philanthropic wealthy people finance a non-playing orchestra? So I see a certain danger, and I think we who run orchestras, we have to seriously think how to reform and how to go on and be part of a modern society.
Absolutely. So you lay out quite a strong minefield in the way of this wonderful beast continuing to exist, and I think in many ways the issues that face culture, music in the middle of that, and classical music that we're involved in, and I think we'll get to all of that. But to ask you some more about the issues that you already outlined. The issue of volume, there were a number of responses immediately also from our friends joining us. One is Ed Yim, the artistic administrator of New York Philharmonic and now the American Composers Orchestra. Ivan, he asks, it occurs to me that there's also the volume of the number of concerts that might be an issue. And he wonders if you think there are too many concerts these days that make the experience less special. And I would like to in some way connect the two questions. Do you think the volume and the increasing volume is not only because of the musicians' enthusiasm, as you mentioned, and the inventions of the mechanisms, but also because of the concert halls and the sizes that we have aimed for in constructing concert halls and in the population that's expected to attend?
I picked the problems. I don't want to list all the problems. We can list other problems, but I concentrated now on the volume, which is too loud for the ear. So if you put an orchestra on stage, at the moment, the volume of loud instruments are damaging the ear of people sitting close to them, and it is impossible to continue like this. I think this is a big danger. And of course, what you say are other dangers, but I don't want to get too much into this. I simply wanted to pick a few to demonstrate that the symphony orchestra is an endangered species, you know.
Yes.
But I think we should concentrate more on what to do.
Yes, this was my next question, what to do, and also obviously, in the good sense, the elephant in the room is the Budapest Festival Orchestra, and the many visionary things that you've tried, not only in terms of the interpretation, but in terms of exactly the solutions to the things that you named. So, so what can be done? And what can be done in Budapest that can be transposed to other places?
Yes, you know, the Budapest Festival Orchestra, I consider my laboratory. What I'm working on there is exactly the orchestra of the future, which will be a different type of organization than the normal symphony orchestra of today. And I firmly believe in this because we cannot continue very long with the present system. Now, before saying anything about what we do in Budapest, which is obviously not perfect. I mean, I don't want to say that I solve all the problems. And I had certain dreams how to create a new style orchestra, and maybe 60–70% worked. Not everything, but
that's an
it's interesting.
That's an incredible percentage too.
Well, yes, but I would like to do a little more. But let's just look a little bit of I want to concentrate actually on one person who was visionary about this, and this was Pierre Boulez. Boulez had a very clear idea of what the orchestra of the future should look like, and he gave it a name. He called it a pool of musicians. It should be a pool of musicians who can make music in a large variety and flexible way. Now, why did he have this idea? And now we have to imagine the modern composer. Put yourself somehow in the mind of a composer. Every composer wants to compose for a combination of maybe instruments or singers, which expresses best the modern idea. And a symphony orchestra is a frozen idea of Mahler and Richard Strauss, if I may put it as simply as this. Why would somebody compose for the score of Richard Strauss? Simply because this is the task. You get a commission, you are commissioned to do so. And here is an old style formation. You are the composer, I give you a commission. Please compose something for our 60 strings, for the number of flutes, trombones. You can add a few special percussions if you want to. But please don't add many strange instruments because it costs us extra money. And this is the usual commission an orchestra gives to a composer, but it's not a natural thing. Most composers actually, if they have a free choice, they much rather compose for ensembles, for a combination of instruments of their choice. And this usually includes a few contemporary instruments which are not part of the symphony orchestra. There are a lot of compositions of the last half century which include, I mean, in the case of, I think now about certain people, John Adams loved to compose for synthesizers and samplers and added it to the symphony orchestra. Messiaen invented this on the martineau, this, you know, this new instrument which pops up in his works all the time. Other composers come up with all kinds of things, and they love to combine old instruments like the violin with a new idea. Now, naturally, a composer composes for an ensemble and a combination of sounds which comes out of his or her imagination. Not necessarily for the symphony orchestra, which is an old-fashioned combination of things. So Boulez naturally said that ideally, the future orchestra should be a pool of musicians who do a large variety of things. Out of that, he, the composer, can pick I don't know, a harmonica and a harmonium and God knows what, electric guitar and 3 violins and 2 flutes and whatever, and then has a free creative possibility to compose. So I completely understand him as a composer, but I want to add that the idea of a pool of musicians is wonderful because it allows to extend the repertoire in other directions. For example, here is the question of early music. At the moment, it's usually it's in the hands of specialists. Maybe Bach is played by everybody, which is right, and I absolutely agree. But if you think of Schütz or Monteverdi or Dufay or Ockeghem, then the symphony orchestra is hopelessly not able to even touch that music. And it's in the hand of specialists. If we would have a loose pool of musicians, that pool should be able to make excursions into this territory and somehow provide the audience with earlier music than, let's say, Haydn or Bach, and contemporary music, and even, why not a little jazz, why not a little improvised music? Actually, our generation needs everything. What they would love to hear is a mix. There is an audience for world music. There is an audience for crossovers. There is an audience for pop music, for early music, for all kinds of music. If you look at the repertoire, what a concert hall, a building offers, and you can have a little more conservative ones or a very contemporary-minded concert hall like Brooklyn Academy of Music, for example, in New York. All types of music is offered to the audience, and only a fraction of it can be practiced by the symphony orchestra. So the idea of a pool of musicians is brilliant, and I'm very thankful for Pierre Boulez for opening my eyes to it. So I agree with him that this will be the future orchestra, a looser family of musicians who are capable to make music in different forms. There are, for example, concert halls nowadays who have a permanent resident orchestra. The Concerthaus Berlin has the Concerthaus Orchestra Berlin. And I could continue endlessly. The Philharmonie in Berlin has the Philharmoniker and so on. And there are concert halls which have no orchestra, and they have a much easier freedom to offer a larger variety of music. Now, this is again a danger which threatens the symphony orchestra, that more and more concert halls will want to have, please, no orchestra which binds my hands. let me have the freedom to offer any type of music to our audiences, because this is what they love. This is what they want to hear. Now, how would a pool of musicians look like? And here I can now turn a little bit to our experiences. I've been experimenting with this idea for a few decades now in a more and more radical form. And of course, I'm very, very happy with most achievements of the Budapest Festival Orchestra, because this is how we work. We actually play regularly symphony orchestra repertoire, but we do many other things. And I want to give you two examples. One example is that within the Budapest Festival Orchestra, we have a group who play on period instruments. They play early music all the time. Sometimes they give concerts alone. Sometimes we even incorporate and combine it with other type of music. There is another group in the orchestra who specialize on Hungarian and Transylvanian folk music. This is a small group, but this is their passion. This is what they love. And we build it into our concert programs, and we regularly give work to them as an orchestra.
But additionally, these are all members of the symphonic repertoire pool, so to say. They'll be also playing the Strauss and the Mahler.
Absolutely, with one difference. If you think of a conventional symphony orchestra, maybe that they also have 3 musicians who love to do Transylvanian folk music, but they do it as a hobby. They do it as their private work. The organization, the symphony orchestra, has nothing to do with it. We promote it. We build it into our concert activities, and we equally put certain improvised jazz on. We occasionally organize modern ensemble music concerts where we pick members of our orchestra to play. Now, this needs a different contract system than the conventional orchestra does. We abandoned the idea of thinking in services, in Dienst, in the German kind of orchestra slang. We don't give, because the idea of services is a very, very interesting idea. You have a musician on a salary, and for that salary, the musician needs to do a certain number of services. But hundreds or thousands of regulations, the Americans call it the CBA, the Collective Bargaining Agreement. The Europeans have something similar in various Kollektivvertrag type agreements. They limit the management to what they can ask the musician to do. So it's a little bit like, we give you the salary, then the musician says, you can ask me to do only this and nothing else. That is somehow the agreement between the two. We abandon this system completely. We give our musicians who are, let's say, the core members of the orchestra, a very, very basic salary, like 15 or 20% of their income. And we act as a production house, putting on all kinds of music and asking the musicians to take part in them. And sometimes they come up with suggestions, they make program proposals, and we as a production house, we promote, we present these type of concerts. Maybe half of it is orchestra concerts, the other half a large variety of musical activities because we treat them as a pool of musicians who have a basic salary, but then are paid for what they do. Now, the other example I want to mention is what we did during the coronavirus sudden stop. That, you know, the stopping of orchestras was a very dramatic moment, also for us, for everybody. I personally had a rehearsal of Mahler's Third Symphony with the Concerthaus Orchestra in Berlin. Morning, afternoon, I received a message, tomorrow no more, rehearsal is finished. Orchestras are not allowed to play anymore. That, I think the following evening, we had a big Zoom conference and I talked to all our musicians in Budapest and said, orchestra music is out, not possible because there is a virus. And we overnight changed our orchestra into a full-time chamber music society. And we gave online chamber music concerts every night. We had, I think, over 70 in this period. And in different formations, the musicians played together. It wasn't too much of a danger because it's only 3 or 4 of them who were together, not 100. And I talked to a very trustworthy expert of virus and dangers. And he was very nice. He actually said that, you know, life goes on even in these circumstances. One needs basic services from electricity, water, food, and a little music belongs to that because it will help people to stay at home. And we played online chamber music concerts every evening, and exactly this was the message we received, that it helped people stay at home. So it was wonderful to be able to turn the orchestra from overnight, from an orchestra to a chamber music society, but it was only possible because we have a completely different contract arrangement with the musicians, which is much more flexible, and we abandoned this whole idea of tenures and CBAs and collective agreements. And I believe that it works beautifully, and it will step by step lead to Boulez's vision, you know, vision of Pierre Boulez, the pool of musicians, which could be the next step in the symphony orchestra.
Yes, it's wonderful. So a few questions that rise to mind, and there was a question from Susanne Klingenstein. What would be the economic reality of a pool of musicians? Would they still be musicians with contracts so they have predictable income? You partly answered that, but to follow that up. So basically, the more creative your musicians are, the more projects that are special projects that they propose, the more their income can be increased. So you provoke them also in this economically to be more creative. And
yes, of course, it needs very careful leadership because there is a little competition. There's a little, what you say, that a more creative person has more opportunities. However, one has to be very careful about this because we don't want a kind of wild competitive, it has to stay a family. But I think there would be 2 extremes and both equally wrong. One extreme would be if there would be constant pressure and stress and, you know, this big differences. I don't think it's necessary. I believe much more in bringing out and encouraging the creativity in all our musicians. But the other extreme, I also disagree that the services salary mentality.
So this is in Budapest, you said the managing of the situation and the 2 extremes of creative competition and sort of disengaged following the service calendar. But to be devil's advocate, I mean, I find the ideas wonderful. You are making it work. I think a lot of this might be taken as a sort of red cloth provocation for typical, let's say, unionized American musician and the very encroached system of the musicians' union. Do you think this will just evolve and dissipate because of the pressures on the orchestra, that the unions will have to come to terms with edging towards the pool of musicians and not this tenured forever, these are my services contracts?
I hope people will think about it and find solutions. I don't know how people will find solutions. And if certain union rules need to be reformed, changed, adapted, or completely abandoned, I don't know how people will find solutions. All I want to say is that in the present form works against the symphony orchestra. So I hope that a few caring people will think about reforms. And then, for example, I want to give an idea about a few absurd details of the present system. For example, with auditioning, now people audition, there are finalists, there is a winner, and there is, let's say, a runner-up. And I think the runner-up usually is, in my experience, is very good, but he or she doesn't get the job. The person who gets the job gets suddenly the full defensive mechanism of unions, for example, and the runner-up has nothing. Who cares about the runner-up? Once I remember a few decades ago, I wanted to start a league to support the finalists of auditions who drop out, because they are very good, they achieved something, but nobody cares about their tomorrow. So, I mean, I think
which is the general cruelty of competitions also, and in some way of this competitive society. People want the winners, but the runners-up.
Yes, but if you look at it in a broader view, I think the dividing line between the people who are in a symphony orchestra and who are out of it is too rigid. People may be out of a symphony orchestra because of a variety of reasons. Maybe they are chamber music lovers. They had the dream to build a string quartet and practiced hours and hours, concentrated less on the orchestra repertoire, but are wonderful musicians, but they are not part of the system. Or somebody who is maybe a great person, but never had the nerve to play a good audition. I know many musicians, wonderful in the orchestra, not good at auditions. Mm. And many other examples who are, one reason or the other, didn't enter the club.
And I have a question.
You know, maybe family reasons or any reasons. And I think the pool of musicians idea opens the door to many musicians who don't feel as specialized in the symphony orchestra as the habit is nowadays.
Mm. And do you think, I'm curious, since you are obviously looking and dreaming of very versatile musicians, and there's been several questions in this direction, has this changed your audition process? Because how can you find that person that plays a good Strauss excerpt, but then turns out to be masterful as an improviser or playing folk music? Or have you added components of getting to know the candidates in a way that allows you to select these people that are more versatile than typical, perhaps?
Yes, I must say I haven't found a magic recipe, so I don't have a perfect audition alternative I cannot offer. I can offer only a few compromise solutions which I found, and that is to rethink the order. At the moment, the habit is first audition, then the winner gets a trial period. This is the habit. And I think this has disadvantages because among the 3 or 4 finalists, if all of them would have a chance to play with the orchestra could easily find out which one fits into the group, who plays better in the orchestra. There might be a great audition performer who in the orchestra somehow gives a little less, contributes less to the whole than the other one who was maybe a little less good at the audition, but is a wonderful member of the orchestra. So what we do is we reverse this order. We actually invite 3, 4, 5 candidates into that job and for a few projects, and we try people out within the orchestra, and we also listen to them like in an audition. But the order is not first audition, then the winner gets the trial.
Mm-hmm. That's of course the more patient and seemingly more long-term productive way. And do you see that this broadening of the expectations and interests of the audience and of the musicians, do you see that impacting music education, and how should music education be evolving with it? And I think obviously in Hungary the early music education has been traditionally a very strong and active system, and I think that's something that a lot of the Western world suffers from, this lack of a centralized early music education system. What do you feel about that?
I agree. I think a lot has to be done to make education a part of life of actually every musician. This idea came from a wonderful, legendary orchestra leader in Los Angeles, Ernest Fleischmann, who once initiated the idea, which I liked very much, that every musician, like each member of an orchestra, should contribute maybe 10% of his or her activities to teaching. Pass on the knowledge of what you have. And I really liked this idea because there are, of course, members of orchestras who teach, but not all of them. The majority doesn't. And teaching is very important. And I think music teaching should also be seen in a broader context. At the moment, and I don't want to now go very far and reform the music teaching profession, but I think that it's interlinked with the problem of symphony orchestras. If you look at conservatories all over the world, many actually prepare the student for the audition. And this actually serves the rigidity of the orchestra system. Whereas I think I'm much happier to see conservatories teaching music and teaching creativity to people rather than preparing them for this practical test of an audition. And if you look at it in an even broader, with an even broader mind, I don't think we should teach music to the future professionals only. We should teach music to as many people as possible. Because, for example, if you are a pensioner, it's wonderful if you can play the piano at home and not only be a member of the audience, but at least make a little chamber music at home. Do music actively as part of your life. And like equally then, the tennis teachers play tennis not to professional tennis players, but to the society. We professional musicians, we should teach the population to express themselves with music. This is the real important task to do, not only to bring up the professionals, and especially not to bring up professionals to win auditions.
And touching on the education and culture and the musicians in a pool of musicians in symphony orchestra, generally though, this question comes up a lot, and I think we're constantly faced with it. Why does it matter at all? And does the Haydn Divertimento matter at all, except to us that because some of our parents have pushed us, or we are so particularly enthusiastic about the Haydn Divertimento? But why should the government be supporting classical music and culture in general? I think this is a question that's constantly discussed, and there are few great answers. So is it an unanswerable question, we just do it because we find it amusing? Or do you, for yourself, feel a humanistic statement? Why is it important?
Music is very, very important. Music brings people together. Music creates trust and peace. I don't think if people happily listen to Mozart, then in the next moment they would kill each other easily.
Even though the Second World War puts some doubt into that statement quite unilaterally.
I think it's independent. There were many Nazi music lovers. It's absolutely true. But I don't think this proves that music would be the factor which turned them into these horrible creatures they became. I wouldn't agree with that. I think music has the ability to break down walls. Music, first of all, has no language barriers. Music can contribute to the integration, to understanding of different people. When people cannot speak with each other because one speaks Chinese and the other one Hungarian, they can still make music together, smile at each other, and experience the contact of these two people. I really believe that music is a fantastic gift of all of us, which we must make sure that the fire doesn't go out. It needs huge reforms because it has to go on and satisfy the future generations, the curiosity, the desire for innovations, which is a natural aspect of the young generation always. Young people want new music. They don't want to repeat the old music of their grandparents. So we have to create instruments, and the symphony orchestra is also an instrument which encourages the taste of the young generation too. And we have to make it easy to incorporate new music, any type of innovations. And on the other hand, preserving our museums, our old canon, the tradition which we pass on. As we teach history in schools, we should also keep the music history alive. We pass on a know-how and the tradition, and in the same time satisfy the curiosity and desire for innovation.
Yes, no, I'm, of course, I think we are on the same side, but I am here in some way to try to play the devil's advocate. You say music breaks down walls. Certainly, it comes in moments that are very important for humanity, but there seems to be a danger, and I wonder how you feel about this danger of also music, and in this case, our case, classical music, being subverted for political purposes, or being subverted as a pretty shield for certain regimes. We can think of the Soviet regime, the Nazi regime, the political landscape has been difficult to navigate, also particularly for conductors, for quite some time, from Karl Muck to Furtwängler to Bravinsky, and I think you yourself have had to navigate for quite a long time since you founded the orchestra, the political landscape. What do you feel about this danger of music being subverted for these other purposes, and what is the strategy to deal with that?
Kirill, this is a wonderful question, and it's very important. Music has a huge power on the emotion, and therefore it can be easily used for manipulation. And it was right, this was the reason why Thomas Mann wrote somewhere that music is a politically suspicious art. It's suspicious because it manipulates you. If I may only give you this example of film music. If the film director wants you to feel a certain danger, if let's say it's a thriller, then it's very easy to choose music which puts you in the mood. Or if in a romantic situation, the right choice of music manipulates you, the film watcher, very easily. It affects and intrudes your emotions more than anything else. So music can be used for you to feel certain emotions, and naturally, politicians or people representing a certain political issue, they use music to manipulate you. It's very easy for them. And you were right, various dictatorial regimes used music to manipulate the population. Now, if we are aware of it, then we should be also aware that yes, music can be used in our time. For example, if I may just say a very practical thing, it can be nationalistic, or it can serve the integration of the world, or Europe at least. Because why the integration of Europe? I think much of our music, from Brahms to Bartók and composers who were born in certain countries, actually create a European art. Not only music, the painters who moved from the Netherlands to Italy and created a bridge there, the whole Renaissance, it actually created an international or European mixed art forms. I mean, who was Franz Liszt? Was Franz Liszt Hungarian or Italian or German or French?
I think an Austrian composer.
Yeah, you can say
that learned Hungarian in his 60s, no?
Yes, but what came from a family from there? I mean, one can argue. I would say that Franz Liszt was a European composer who clearly had influences, and he also influenced music in many countries. So music can be a tool for Europe. But music can also serve nationalist purposes. And you can say the Finnish orchestra should only play Finnish music, and what we should listen is the authentic Ravel played by a French orchestra. And if somebody argues that the real Richard Strauss or Wagner can only be performed by a German orchestra, it serves nationalist purposes. And if we are all aware of it, then we keep an eye on it and make sure that we musicians and our audiences are not misused by manipulated music by anybody who wants to manipulate them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, though, as a side effect, though nationalism is terrible, I think we will both agree, some of the most wonderful music that is the core of the symphonic repertoire in early 20th century is rising from this nationalist, at the time, maybe somewhat better nationalistic sentiment, but be that Janacek or Rachmaninoff or Bartók, or Dvorak, there is that national identity search that actually created a lot of beautiful music that seems to be the core of the symphonic repertoire. And
yes, but very important to know that this was another period when the Austro-Hungarian Empire started to have inner tensions, which actually led for the end of the empire. Various nationalist movements developed, like the Bohemians, the Czechs, which you hear in the music of Smetana and Dvorak. This was their clearly nationalist music. I think one shouldn't shy away to see it as that. And there was nationalist Hungarian music in the time of Franz Erkel and many other situations. But as the history develops and the idea of nationalism turned evil, and the idea of integration became the beautiful goal of mankind, composers change. For example, if you look at the example of Béla Bartók, he composed nationalist music when he was between the age of 20 and 22, around 1904. For example, the Kossuth Symphony is an absolute nationalist work. But very soon, with the emerging Nazis, he made a U-turn and he became the most cosmopolitan composer you can imagine, who actually said that the last movement of his concerto for orchestra should be seen as a dance scene of all nations together who celebrate of the being together idea.
Yes, this turn is quite universal among, well, not universal, but one encounters it often among intellectuals, because Thomas Mann, whom you've mentioned earlier, also went from a rather
Yes.
German nationalist to an absolute cosmopolitan denier of things nationalist, and certainly the wars had their effect on them. You mentioned, so we are in the societal level, and to get back somewhat to the music and the concert giving, the online concerts, and not only the online concerts, because we had a lovely comment from Tom Service, whom I'm sure you know, that not only online, he said the BFO gave 224 serenade concerts with small distance ensembles in Budapest buildings. And this is the kind of service that Tom thinks orchestras also should be providing. But what do you think about the evolution of music consumption that in some way has been terribly accelerated now by the pandemic and these online concerts? While you were away on one of the service interruptions, I said that I have my share of doubts about the ability of the online concert to sort of provide this transcendent music experience that I have had in real life. How about you? Have you had a transcendent experience in front of a laptop screen with one of the recent streams? And do you think that's possible to expect, to hope for, or is this just a temporary bridge?
Well, I think that one has to turn the necessity into a virtue. The pandemic created a necessity, and now we should look at what is good in it. What is something which we can use for the future, for the transition from the old style symphony orchestra to the new one. And I think already with the Budapest Festival Orchestra, we did a large number of going out to the people. We gave concerts before the pandemic, in many concerts in schools, in retirement homes, all over, I mean, in many hospitals and so on. Because this is part of my thinking, that I think the idea of the concert hall belonged to a generation where there was an elite part of the society. It's not anymore the aristocracy, it's more the educated elite who go to the concert hall and consume classical music. And the largest part of the society is shut out, cut out, I mean, a variety of reasons. Now, we are gradually moving into a more and more classless society. And the symphony orchestra should serve the classless society, not the typical, the shrine of the elite, the concert hall, where people buy expensive tickets and feel a part of a social club. We should serve them too, but we shouldn't forget the rest of the society. And the pandemic, because it actually sort of excluded the concert hall for a while, gave us a good opportunity to look for alternative concert forms. And one of them is what you just mentioned, the serenades. People were locked in their apartments, and we gave over 200 concerts in apartment buildings from courtyards and similar, maybe a silent square or a street, and people listened from windows and balconies. But this was simply finding the good side of the pandemic, finding something good in it, which gave us this opportunity. And we will always look out for ways to bring music to the poor, to the young, to the people who were less fortunate in receiving the type of education which naturally led them to concert halls. The future orchestra must go out to the people and not expect everybody to simply buy subscriptions in concert halls.
Mm. And there's a question from Clara Bernat. She's wondering if Maestro Fischer would like to give his take on the length of pieces played in relation to, on the one hand, the area of expertise, for example, of Symphony Orchestra Hein Messiaen, and on the other hand, the current attention span of just a few minutes in the internet age, taking into account that you cannot produce art of depth when you have 90 seconds to deliver, at least in Clara's opinion. And I know you've done a lot of very creative things in Budapest and in Berlin with programs, length of programs, the kind of mixed programming. So where's your thinking on that now?
The length changes with time. There are periods if you look at music of the 14th century, 14th, 15th century, the music works there. I mean, typical ballad of Machot is 3-4 minutes. The troubadour, trouvère songs are also similar length. Then there was a fascination of, in the 19th century, of extreme length. Wagner was not the only person who created huge long evenings in operas. There were these, you know, these novels which have many volumes, written by Proust or Tolstoy, which you have on your shelves of volume 1, 2, 3, or 4, one huge novel. And I don't think many authors write novels of this length anymore. It was in that period. People were looking for this mega length in art.
Tantric experience in art.
Yes, and it changes. Now it's true that that, for example, if you compare the conventional movie lasting maybe between 1 and 2 hours to the clip of today, which is maybe up to 3 minutes, that at the moment we seem to live in a generation which loves these 3-minute units. And if you hear a pop song lasting 10 minutes, there are a few, by the way. I always think it's how interesting that a few pop composers dare to come out with a 10-minute piece. But it's the exception. There is the usual length is this 3 to 4 minutes. There must be something, and I'm not an expert. It would be wonderful to have a scientific study on the attention span of why people love the 3 to 4 minute. I mean, why don't we have 30-second pop songs? I don't know. I mean, there must be some interesting reason. But this is somehow our time, and it's a little bit out of the trend to perform the usual 2-hour concert, which is now a rigid ritual which we inherited from our parents and grandparents. But it may come back, or maybe, you know, there will be again time when people love to hear Satie's endless piano piece, which lasts about 24 hours.
Yes, well, yesterday you and I spoke, and I hope that I might be able to convince you to come and speak about that, about Monteverdi and his look at sort of the ancient Greek package of programming and the drama and the satire and the music. And so it's interesting to think about these as also changing fashions of how one spends an evening. There was an earlier question, and that's interesting, and I don't want to miss it. So a couple chapters back, but there was a question about the number, if you have a feeling of an ideal number for this pool of musicians. This was from Maris Gottoni. He said, how small can a pool of musicians as defined by Mr. Fischer and Pierre Boulez be? Is there an ideal size? And what's your feeling?
Yes, good question. I at the moment, I ended up with a system which can be seen as a small circle surrounded by a bigger circle and a third circle. So there is an inner circle and then bigger ones. We have a complicated system in which, if you are a member of our inner circle, there are, I think, 60 to 70 members there. Then you play regularly with us and you do everything. But we notice that we also need people whose life is partly with us and partly somewhere else, maybe in chamber music or teaching or whatever. So we have a second circle of our pool who have slightly less obligations. They give less guarantee to us and we give less guarantee to them. And that's the second circle. And then there is a third circle who we regularly employ, but less frequently. It could be the nature of the instrument. If you are a cymbalom player, you are less often required than a flutist. So at the moment, I operate with these circles, and altogether, I think I cannot answer the question, what would be the ideal size
but
of
this
the
gives
pool.
us, yeah, this gives us.
But I can tell you what we do. We have in the three circles altogether maybe 120, 130 musicians. The inner circle about 65, 70. And it's very important that you can step in and out. For example, there is a young mother who came to me recently, said the children are small, I would like to do less. I go to the second circle from the first. The same young lady comes back to me, children are big enough, I want to do a little more. So we let people do less or more.
And in Budapest, in your orchestra, how often do people re-audition, or is there such a thing as re-auditioning, or is it once you're in similar to tenured positions elsewhere?
We never do re-auditioning. I think audition is a terrible thing anyway. I mean, once you had it in your life, I hope you don't need to do it again. However, each musician takes part in chamber music activity and even solo activity. And I know each musician personally exactly what is their strengths, weaknesses, how they improve, what happens to them. Auditions are not necessary in our type of activity because, for example, when we do children's concerts, we always do solo or a combination of 2-3 instruments. I hear our musicians all the time individually. We even have an internal little competition, what we do. It's voluntary, you may decide to take part or not, which is for concertos, because I think one should give chance to the tutti player too, to show that he or she can play a solo concerto wonderfully. And if you turn out to be the winner or one of the winners, then your production will be performed with the orchestra. So it's possible in our system that you are a tutti viola player who ends up as a soloist next year.
Mm. And not to ask you specifically about the BFO, but generally one of the things within the symphonic organization seems to be the difficulty of people, let's say, who have been wonderful 45 years earlier, but I've played with some orchestra where there were some wonderfully senior members, sometimes in their late 80s, who really could not be fit to play anymore. Yet, for example, within the American system, it is nearly impossible to propose such a thing. How do you think, we spoke about the entering into the orchestra, how can the exiting from the orchestra be dealt with in a, let's say, graceful and noble way? Or is there a graceful and noble way?
Yes, it's much easier because in the normal conventional tenure orchestra, the choice is between member or pensioner. So if you are, let's say, nearing retirement age, in the United States, there is no such thing. So somebody has to make the decision that you retire, and you have to make the decision, or a complicated and painful processes if the orchestra asks you to retire. But the dividing line is huge, because you are either a member or you are out and you are a pensioner. In our case, where we have a pool of musicians, you can do it in a kind of soft landing way, because you can stay a member but do less. You will be probably also asked to do less, because other people will not ask you as a chamber music partner. I will also ask you less if you have difficulties playing less well in the recent years. However, there are certain things you still do very well, and we keep asking you because you are a member, but it's a gradual, soft process, and it doesn't have this problem that, for example, you are in a key position in a conventional orchestra, like playing the first trumpet, but you can't play the trumpet anymore. That's a terrible, painful situation. And in our case, it's not possible, because you are maybe one of the trumpetists and we ask you less for dangerous solos.
I cannot resist asking some purely musical grounds, but I think this relates to the versatility of your group. I think some of our participants today will know, and others won't, that the Budapest Festival Orchestra is also a wonderful choir. You have gotten a lot of deserved attention for your encores at the proms and other venues, and also I think I seem to have heard that you, for a while, or maybe this tradition continues, would use Bach chorales at the beginnings of your rehearsals to get everybody so attuned. Could you tell a little bit about this, because I think this is really quite unique and fascinating.
The two are two completely different things.
And I want to know about them.
Yes, the idea of the chorales by Bach came from a suggestion of Heinz Holliger. Holliger is a good friend and a wonderful artist for whom I have great respect. And I talked to him about wind intonation and about the idea that it's so difficult to develop this in an orchestra. It's a complicated issue. I don't want to get too deeply into this. It's a long subject. However, Holliger gave me this advice about 30 or 40 years ago, I don't remember exactly when, that let them play chorales by Johann Sebastian Bach, and it will gradually improve their intonation. And I thought, what a wonderful idea. This is the most brilliant advice I've ever had. Immediately we started to do this. We created a set, made a little arrangement. You don't need to arrange anything, just transpose for the transposing instruments like B-flat clarinets and English horns and so on. And since then, we regularly play these chorales every morning when we rehearse, and it helped. And it has a second effect, that people experience it as a wonderful start of the day. It's almost like, it feels like a morning prayer. Nothing to do with religion, of course. It's just beautiful, which separates the outside world from the rehearsal. And it's great to do. So I'm very grateful for this advice to Mr. Holliger.
And this is at every rehearsal. You start every rehearsal with a Bach chorale.
Yes.
And these are arranged. And these are arranged.
Yes, it's not arranged. We simply give it to the people, choose a part, play the top part or the second part. Actually, people decide in the orchestra. And we tune, and then we start. We play a chorale by Bach, and then we start rehearsing. It's part of the tuning, actually, in the morning. Now, the other thing you mentioned is the singing, is that you know, the original idea came suddenly when I thought that there are many music teachers, instrument teachers, who tell the student, sing, meaning let's sing on the violin, do it like a singer. And suddenly it came, this idea came like a sudden idea to me. What do they mean? How? I mean, does this flutist or violinist, does he or she have experience with singing? If they don't have the experience, how sing? What does it mean? And I thought, why not have the experience? If they have the experience, then they will sing more on their instruments. So next day I walked into the orchestra and I said, we will start singing. Let's start to vocalize, mama, 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 mama. And we just started. And we do vocal exercises all the time. Occasionally I ask experts like choir masters, singers, but sometimes we just simply do it ourselves. And over the course of, I don't know, 3-4 years, maybe 5 years we are doing this, the orchestra developed into a wonderful choir. And now you mentioned that we do encores. Yes, we occasionally do that, but now we even build it into concert programs. We sing works by, for example, Dvorak has beautiful choral works, and it's in the program. And the people put down their instruments, they sing an a cappella work by Dvorak, and everybody loves it. The musicians love it, the audiences love it, and many advantages. First of all, we want to set an example that everybody should overcome the fears and inhibitions and sing. Second, it helps the playing, the breathing, the idea of phrasing. And, you know, it's again something liberating, you know, for the musicians that they can do it. Of course, there is one important thing. You have to make sure that you have an equal balance between men and women.
Yes, well, it's very humanizing, I think, the singing, and I think it brings your musicians even closer for the perception of the audience, because perhaps people cannot play the cello or the timpani, but singing they can sort of imagine. And I think this is really very much a human bridge. And I will come back to the balance of women and men, because I think that's a question not to be ignored. But while we were on the subject of singing, there was a question earlier from Nicholas Bervin from London, who was asking about the opera and whether that form with less flexibility perhaps, or maybe you don't see it this way, has a worse or better chance of surviving into the future, which was our departure point today. You have done opera, you have staged or directed opera. Do the similar concepts apply to opera houses, in your opinion, opera orchestras, or is this really even less of a flexible beast?
This would lead very, very far. I don't want to give you real answers because it would need much more time. I can only give, no, but I also think we shouldn't overload people with this. I want to touch on it with just one or two thoughts. One is that we have to be aware that opera also is a leftover, that opera used to be around the aristocratic courts. They loved to do it for carnivals and large celebrations like weddings, for example, within royalty and aristocratic courts. And somehow opera survived with its orchestra, singers, combination of theater and so on. I don't want to get too much in it, but there were attempts to create a more modern art form. And I want to mention only one attempt, and this was the theater around Bertolt Brecht. When Brecht created a new style of music theater with musicians around him like Kurt Weill, Dessau, and others who created a minimalist, modern, and politically motivated new music theater form. I think it was a very promising development, and unfortunately it died because the Nazis came and all these people had to emigrate. Brecht, Weill, and many others emigrated to the United States, and in Europe, this new form of opera was suddenly like not discontinued.
Guillotine.
And this discontinuation is very sad, and I would very much hope that people should pick it up. This tiny orchestra, and for simple audiences, not the elite, not the continuation of the old court opera, but something for the audience Brecht had in mind.
Mm. Well, in some way, we had a lecture earlier by your compatriot, Mr. Fazekas, about Kurtak's opera, which has this sort of smaller band-like moments, but perhaps it's not exactly for the simplest and unprepared listeners, but hopefully everybody tries. Just a couple more questions, because it's irresistible to question you before we let you go, because I know it's a lot of your time. You said when it came to choir singing, equal or relative balance between female and male voices, and this is obviously very much a justly pertinent issue today, also in classical music, with the ratio with conductors, composers, and still within the orchestras, the balanced representation of men and women. But it has this other danger when there is this reverse obsession to meet the quota no matter what. And I'm sure this is something you face with in programming, or people trying to enter the orchestra, or in the guest conductors that you have in front of the orchestra. What's your recipe for finding that balance?
I don't think one needs to do anything, because it naturally happens. I find it very strange that if I look at old films of Furtwängler conducting his orchestra, or anybody, Sir Thomas Beech, I mean, this generation, that it was completely only men. It's very, very strange, but this was the norm for that time. And now we live in a society in which it's completely natural for women to do all types of jobs. Why not orchestra? Obviously, they play in orchestras, they learn instruments, they become conductors, and it's absolutely natural and right. And I don't think one even needs quotas, because there's a large number of ladies coming to orchestras, also wonderful conductors in the young generation. Conducting seems to be one of the last bastions of which is dominated by men, but it will be invaded by women. Within 10 or 20 years, probably there will be an equal man-woman ratio in the conducting profession. I don't see any problems, and I don't even see a necessity for a quota.
So this will, no, I don't see either, but I think very often, I think there was some statement at some point from the BBC that in some years, the proms, there should be 50% male composers and 50% female composers, which of course, like any other number, seems to be an artificial one. But so your feeling is that it is a natural flowing process and will balance itself out and continue.
Yes, I think so. It will balance itself. I don't see any problems there. I find actually very interesting, but this leads very far, that in the music language, we still experience certain things as cliché masculine and cliché feminine. For example, there are cadences which are resolute cadences, and there are these more dolce rounding off type of musical phrases. And for a long time, and I remember even I was taught like this, that there is the masculine type of music and the feminine type of music. There are many cliches in music. So one had this idea for centuries that risoluto is a masculine characteristic and dolce is a feminine one. Now, all this needs to be rethought. So it's not only this whole idea of breaking up these old ways of thinking. It's not only about jobs and people, but actually what music itself is.
By the way, in the meantime, the watchful Mr. Tom Service has clarified that what I quoted about BBC was for contemporary composers and commissions, and that is a BBC commitment, and as he comments, and we can agree, and a good one in this context. There was also earlier both a question and a comment. The comment was from Joe Patridge, who said how much he loved your Liszt E-flat major concerto, where he's never witnessed before the brilliant idea of placing the triangle player in front, both from the acoustic perspective and the recognition standpoint. He adds, by the way, I do not play the triangle. But more to the question, Annette Isserlis is saying, talking of balance and going back to the BFO, you're very creative with positioning the instruments to revitalize our attention on particular instrumental lines in the score. And you change from concert to concert. Wouldn't it be nice to see more creativity in general with layout, whatever the size of ensemble or pool of musicians? And I have seen you also move the instruments depending really on the pieces rather than this preordained template of the Wagner-Beethoven orchestra.
You see, the seating changes and the layout changes are a very small part of our reform. But this is probably the most visible to many people. So people find it fascinating that we change seating all the time. I think that this will soon it will go through a huge revolution within a very few years now, because of another factor which has to do with the sheet music. You know, many musicians play now from
iPad.
any type, maybe an iPad. You have an iPad or whatever, electronic sheet music. But this is only a step. It's not the most modern idea. The most modern idea is this augmented reality, AR. If you look up AR, is you have kind of glasses, and in the glasses you can have data, for example, sheet music, through which you can see the conductor, but actually you don't need the paper or the iPad to read music. Now imagine for example, an orchestra having those glasses available. And I don't think, I mean, technology develops incredibly fast. It will be a few years, but it will be available. You don't need the music stand anymore. If you don't need the music stand, the audience doesn't see, it only sees, you know, it's in your glasses or maybe even contact lenses. And that means that people can move. I mean, the musicians could move during they are not stuck to the music stand. So this whole incredibly old, rigid idea of how orchestras sit will be forgotten in a few years. And there will be an orchestra maybe standing as a choir and playing, maybe moving around, creating a choreography. It will open fantastic possibilities for a new way of performing.
Yes, and I'm reminded, and in some way to round off our conversation on the universality of music, the humanity of music, and what you just mentioned, one of the most memorable experiences I've had going to a live concert was when you conducted the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. The particular concert I went to was at that time the Iván Fischer David Geffen Hall in New York. And it was absolutely astounding when we have realized that the choir were, so to say, civilians in the audience, not dressed in concert clothes, and spread between rows and in the balcony and all around us, and the whole auditorium turned into this surround sound experience. And I found it one of the most moving musical experiences ever, in a humanistic way, and also professionally, musically. It's wonderful to be hearing the fountain of thoughts and ideas and provocations and things I'm sure you'll be trying in the near and in the long-term future in your permanent laboratory, the BFO, and I think wherever you come to guest conduct is a laboratory of yours as well, and I think we are very thrilled. I'm certainly as a listener to be part of your musical experiments and to be led to new places. So my one egotistic hope is that I'll be able to convince you to come and talk again, to talk about whatever you'd like. As I said, a complete quodlibet, but you tantalizingly said perhaps the different versions of Monteverdi's Orfeo, and I am tantalized. But in any case, I think it's time for me to thank you for sparing your time and sharing your thoughts, and to thank everybody that's followed this seminar, this talk with Iván, as well as the other 12 this semester. This idea was born only partially out of the coronavirus time, and partially I always wanted to do something like this, and it's not a corona time gimmick, so I look forward to continuing this in the autumn. And until then, I wanted to wish everybody a very healthy and musical and thoughtful and productive time until then. But first and foremost, thank you, Iván.
Well, thank you, Kirill. Very nice. I was very happy and honored to be invited. And it's a great conversation. I'm very happy because what you mentioned, this idea of what happened between the different versions of Monteverdi's Orfeo, it's an important subject to me, which I think affected the music life since then. It has far-reaching consequences, and I would be very happy to talk only about this one issue if you ever have the chance.
Well, I hope that we'll discuss the details, but it would be wonderful if by ending this term, you might find the time to also start up the next one, and with a very specific thing that will certainly lead us to all sorts of directions.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be
Thank
well.
you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.